Okay. So some things are working. So I would play some Handel, if you're familiar with Handel. I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with Handel. It's kind of hard to grow up in America, especially around Christmas time, and not be familiar with the Messiah. And Easter, because actually the Messiah is an oratorio that covers both of those events, historical events, etc. But Handel lived almost precisely the same years that George Berkeley did. So if you look up Berkeley, 1685, 1753, I think Handel lived to like 1751, something like that, somewhere in that same vicinity. So culturally, I could point out that Berkeley would probably be familiar, being in London, being a student in that area, probably familiar with a lot of Handel's stuff. It was quite interesting. Last class, I pointed out, for those of you that like novels, Sophie's World is a novel, a Swedish novel. I forget the name of the author, but if you have a working internet, you could probably look it up. But his basic plot, should I ruin it for you, or are you thinking you might read it? I'll ruin it. Okay.
It's a good book.
It's a good book, so Sean has read it. Sophie is a character who has friends and mother and father's away. He's working for the UN as a colonel, I think, in the military wing of the UN in Africa somewhere. I don't. In any case, so he writes letters back to Sophie, and Sophie, actually, she doesn't know for sure who it is. It's kind of a mystery. But the letters are all questions like, "Who are you?" You know, that's the first one, as I recall. Who are you? And it's like, who am I? Why would you ask a teenage girl that? But of course, it gets into the philosophical aspects of that, and then through the interrelationship then with a local philosopher, who's also a clarinet player. He takes her on like a virtual tour of the various philosophers. So they visit the Middle Ages, they visit Greece, and the scene that I played, of course, is where they're on this little island, mysterious island behind her house, where it's foggy all the time, because they're there, I think, more than once. But the one time they row out to this, and they discover a mirror, and she looks at the mirror, and of course she sees herself, but then she sees someone in the room who wasn't there, and that's George Berkeley, and of course they're talking about the nature of existence, and he argues that in that movie, in that scene, in the book, that what seems, remember, to be the solid table is actually all in the mind. So all of your sense perceptions are in the mind. How's that work? Well, if we look at the target, one of the targets at least, of George Berkeley in his essay, the dialogue that we have in the text. And the dialogue is between Helos, which is Greek for matter, and Philonous, which is philia, love of, nous is mind. So Philonous is love of mind. So this is a dialogue between Berkeley, who's Philonous, and Locke, John Locke, who is Helos, right? And what we discover through this dialogue is that John Locke's philosophy that everything consists of matter, which, when you get right down to it, of course, Locke has a problem with that, and that is that he recognizes, remember, he argues that there's the two kinds of properties that things have. The one is the property that the thing has in itself. the characteristics that make up the thing, which for him would be matter, right? But the other kinds of properties are the secondary qualities. Those are the properties that we see, hear, taste, touch, etc. So all of our perceptions are filtered through our human mechanisms, whatever you want, right? Eyes, etc. All of which are interesting, by the way, to people of this time. Berkeley especially studied the eye. I was trying to figure out how our eyesight worked. And I believe he's the one that realized that by having two eyes, that gives us an opportunity to have perspective. In other words, we can see that chair is further away from me than this one, right? You know, because the two, right? Yes, two eyes give you that ability, right? You know, to know how far away something is, how large, etc. So that's thanks to having two eyes. There's other things that he gets involved with. But so Locke's argument is that while there's these different qualities, we cannot actually hear, see, taste, touch, etc. The thing in itself, the way things are, apart from the way it interacts with us, right? So all that interaction, all that sensitivity that we have to things is mental. It's inside our mind. So, by the way, this is why Locke is considered by many to be the originator of the British empiricist tradition, because unlike Hobbes and Bacon and others, now we have a dilemma, and the dilemma is, how do we know what we perceive to be the case is actually the case? We have to make a leap of faith to say that essentially things are the way we perceive them, but we can never get out of that dilemma. We're solipsistically trapped in our own minds, and we can't actually see the way things really. It's not like you could stand outside of yourself and see yourself looking at an object and see the object as it is in itself and say, "Ah, yes, I'm seeing it fine. I'm seeing it fine. That's the way it looks," right? By the way, Richard Rorty will much later become famous for his book, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. And the idea of it, have I mentioned that before? Richard Rorty. I think we've mentioned that. Where's Sarah? I don't see Sarah today. But in any case, his thesis, Richard Rorty, and I'm sure if I looked it up I won't find anything, sorry, is that's a misleading metaphor. The idea that we can somehow, by refining or fine-tuning our mirror, by polishing it better and better, get a more and more clearer image of the way things really are, right? And the problem with that is, well, but no, we can never actually stand outside of the relationship and see that we're actually seeing things the way things are. We're stuck. Being human, even with our devices, we're stuck, so that all that we experience is essentially what a human being can experience. But even further, that human beings' of experience is all mental events. They're all mental events. Now, you might doubt that that's the case. In fact, I think an awful lot of people today would question that. But at this point, that becomes the persuasive view, that everything that we actually know and experience are these mental events. So that's kind of the accepted but weird point of view at this point. And certainly I'm saying it's an accepted point of view from Berkeley and after, right? But there's an awful lot of people even today that aren't familiar with George Berkeley, aren't familiar with this thesis at all, and those that have come afterwards. They might recognize, oh yes, this is my perspective, that's your perspective, but to recognize that whole point of view seems to naturally lead us to this solipsistic idea that you're really incapable of seeing things the way they are as they are in themselves, right? In fact, that's the expression even, das Ding an sich, or the German for the thing in itself, will become a major issue for Kant, as we will see, etc. So that becomes a real issue. Of course, if you're not educated into the philosophical process, you might totally not realize it's an issue. But nonetheless, if you are, you're aware that, okay, this becomes a problem for us. How do we know that what we're experiencing as mental events literally enable us to know the way things really are? And today we simply might say, well, but the thing is, there is no real way things are. When I look at pick a wall or something that's, the wood paneling. You look at the wood paneling over there and you say it has a particular color. It's a light wood color. It's not mahogany or a dark chestnut or something of that sort. It's not ebony. It's some sort of blonde wood, etc. Well, of course, if I turn off the lights, from Descartes, under different lighting conditions, etc., it looks differently and so on. But actually, the wall as it is in itself has no color at all. Because the whole point of it having color is only the case with regard to an observer who sees things with color. So strictly speaking, that wall has no color in itself. It only appears to have color to someone who views, or I'm sure snakes would see something, maybe heat. I don't know what snakes see. That's always a puzzle. You could talk about bats, of course. Bats are mammals that apparently don't have vision, but they have radar of some sort, sonar or whatever you want to call it, right? So they bounce their voices on things, and the reflection of it enables them to know where things are, right? Bats. So, famous article by Thomas Nagel, What is it like to be a bat? Right? The trouble, of course, is we don't know. We can come up with all kinds of imaginary aspects of what it might be like to be a bat, but when you get right down to it, no, I can't really tell what it's like to be a bat. In fact, I can't tell what it's like to be you. Right? So there's this interesting dilemma that all my experiences is essentially mental events. And for Berkeley, the problem that Locke presents us with is that matter has no life. Matter, as like what we might call quarks or atoms, literally are and Leibniz gives us this with regard to the monads, is that they're a universe within themselves, and they don't have interactions. I mean, in a sense, of course they do, but it doesn't change inside the quark the reaction that it has involved with other things. So essentially, if I take this cap off of this, whatever this is, Gatorade, right? And I take a whole bunch of other caps and I put them on the table and I move them around and stuff. Imagine these are like quarks, right? And all of these are staying perfectly the same in themselves as I move them around. But on another level, of course, I'm looking at, I can make a chess set out of them or something, right? Right? So particles, in that sense, aren't changed by the interactions they have. They're universes within themselves, right? And if that's the case, then my particles that make up my body and make up my mind cannot be influenced by what's going on by the other particles. That's absolutely false, of course, because of course I am interacting with other things. But our contemporary point of view on that is that we're not a single monad ourselves. We're actually a process of many monads or quarks. My mental processes are very complex interrelationship between the various parts of my brain and so on and so forth. But at this point,